And joining us now is a genuine outsider, British cardiologist Dr. Aseem Malhotra. Dr. Malhotra is a relentless public health campaigner and truth seeker, known for speaking out and fighting against big pharma, even if it rubs people up the wrong way. Dr. Malhotra believes the COVID vaccine has been a contributory factor to 30,000 excess deaths from heart disease in the UK. That controversial view is challenged by the mainstream medical community. I'm pleased to say, not only is he out here in Australia, but Dr. Aseem Malhotra is here in the studio with us now. Aseem, great to see you. You had a big sellout performance or event last night in Sydney. You're going on to Canberra, Brisbane, Melbourne, so lots of people can hear you and listen to what you have to say. But let's kick off. So I mentioned the 30,000 excess deaths. We'll get onto that in a second. But tell us, you are a cardiologist. I know you had the tragedy of your father's death. So tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. I think the first thing to say, in terms of the broad overview, what we're dealing with here, they say that in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And what we're dealing with here, without a shadow of a doubt in my view, is probably the greatest medical deception we will witness in our lifetime. And that is specifically in relation to the narrative that has been pushed on the COVID vaccines. Now, just take a step back for a second, Rowan. One of the things we learn in medical school is 50% of what you are taught in medical school will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation. The trouble is nobody can tell you which half, so you have to learn on your own. And I think we can apply that concept, certainly in my evolution, in understanding the situation with the COVID vaccine. So I was one of the first to have 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine in January 2021. I went on Good Morning Britain in February to help tackle vaccine hesitancy when at that stage we were only offering it to high-risk people and the elderly. But the evidence changed very quickly. What became apparent within a few months, which is well known now and established, it wasn't stopping infection, it wasn't stopping transmission, even if it was preventing serious disease and death, and I'll come on to that in a second. And then for me, one of the initial triggers to investigate this further, unfortunately, was my father, who was vice president of the British Medical Association, suffered sudden cardiac death in the summer of 2021. He's a very fit guy. His post-mortem findings didn't make sense. He had very severe coronary artery disease, even though I knew his heart health was pretty good, and he was a very fit guy. And then lots of evidence started to come in, which made it very clear that there was a signal of harm. At that time, I think this is relevant to Australia as well, when we had evidence of signal of harm and it wasn't stopping transmission, our Secretary of State for Health, Sajid Javid at the time, said that we need to mandate this vaccine for healthcare workers. Now, we've never done something like that in the UK. And I then lobbied through the mainstream media, BBC, Sky News over there, and indirectly getting contact with Sajid Javid through the chair of the BMA to say this was unethical, unscientific. And ultimately, we helped. I was one of the campaigners to overturn that. I find it quite extraordinary that in Australia, not only did you do the same sort of mandates, but doctors and nurses lost their jobs if they didn't get the vaccine. And this is, now there's a grassroots movement over here called AMPS, Australian Medical Professional Society, doing great work to try and fight back against this. And given that evidence, I'm going to come on to the most crucial bit in a second. For me, I think it's high time that APRA and the medical boards over here acknowledge the evidence changed, apologise to those healthcare workers and everybody else that lost their jobs, and get them compensated. That absolutely needs to happen. But in evidence-based medicine, that's what I'm an advocate for. Medical ethics, informed consent, improving my patient outcomes. Just looking at the quality of evidence on the harms and benefits of the vaccine. A reanalysis was done by some of the world's most eminent scientists when it comes to integrity. Peter Doshi, Associate Editor, BMJ, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, Santa Greenland, who's probably considered the top epidemiologist in the world. They were able to reanalyze Pfizer and Moderna's original trials, Rowan, that led to approval, coercion, and mandates of this COVID vaccine. And what did they find? They found that from the very beginning, you were more likely to suffer serious harm, disability, life-changing events, hospitalization, than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. What does that mean, Rowan? When I look at that as a doctor, public health campaigner who understands evidence-based medicine, a lot of detail, I campaign on this issue, it means it's most likely that this COVID vaccine should not have been approved for a single human in the first place. It's that bad. This is what we're dealing with now.
Okay, so at that point I've got to step in and say that the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration here in Australia, disagree totally with you, and their claim, or they state that the vaccines are the best way to prevent death and serious disease from COVID. So I'll just say that. You have a lot of critics in Britain. Professor Mark Dweck, the chair of clinical cardiology at the University of Edinburgh, has said of you that I think that Dr. Malhotra's opinions on both statins and COVID vaccines are misguided and in fact dangerous. So they're saying your opinions are dangerous. They're saying that the vast majority of cardiologists do not agree with your views because they are not based on robust science. So there's a big gap between what they're saying and what you're saying. But carry on.
Well, I'm glad you've raised those 2 points. Really glad you've raised it. So let's talk about the TGA. During the summer of 2022, I presented during the BMA annual conference at a fringe event. I gave a presentation, and the people that were present at that event were the chair of the British Medical Association and the president of the British Medical Association. The chair was gobsmacked because I just presented new evidence that had come in the BMJ, done by actually one of your most prolific, brilliant investigative journalists, probably in the world, Marion Damasi, Australian, that revealed that most of the regulators around the world, he was shocked, the chair of the BMA didn't know this, were taking their money from industry. So what does that mean? The FDA getting 65% of their money from pharmaceutical industry. The MHRA in the UK getting 86% of its funding from the pharmaceutical industry. But guess which regulator topped the lot? The TGA. 96% of funding of the TGA comes from the pharmaceutical industry. Now, why is that important?
Okay, well, again, I've got to stop you there because I don't know if that is true or not.
It is absolutely true, but it's true, though, and you can look that up.
Okay,
but on that,
put that to one side.
But that means, and Donald Light, sociologist in the BMJ said, and I agree with him, that the public and doctors and even media and journalists must understand that as long as regulators take money from industry, and we're talking about industries here, multinational corporations whose only motive, legal obligation is to produce profit for their shareholders, and often, according to forensic psychologist Robert Hare, in their pursuit of profit, as entities, not individuals, they behave like psychopaths. Incapacity to experience guilt, deceitfulness, conning others for profit. So we have to understand who's really calling the shots here, Rowan.
If we that is a huge assertion. So yeah, Rita.
Well, there can be very grim consequences for pharmaceutical companies if there are adverse reactions for individuals and if individuals have been misled about the safety of a product. In this instance, though, there's some immunity provided to those companies. So take us through that and what that has done to how things are normally...
Rita, it's a really good point you raise, and quite shocking for most people because even I wasn't fully aware, and I consider myself someone who's a public health campaigner, who's looking at evidence, looking at manipulations and excesses of pharma. And it was only much later on that I was told, when I researched it, because it wasn't mainstream news, it wasn't discussed in detail at the beginning, that drug companies, at the very beginning, who were manufacturing these vaccines, got immunity from governments across the world. If vaccine injuries were to occur, they could not be sued. Now, for me, and I've spoken to somebody, by the way, somebody who's quite senior, a corporate lawyer, who actually contacted me, very senior, involved in this, who didn't take the vaccine. For him, in all his work, he said to me, Dr. Malhotra, for me, that was a clear red flag that something fishy was going on, and that was enough for him not to take it.
But you could say that occurred because, we had a worldwide pandemic, we had these crippling lockdowns, and we needed a vaccine to be developed in record time. So to provide that immunity, you can see why it was for the greater good, perhaps.
Well, absolutely, Rita, but the fact is, if that was the case, they cannot then say, we know that this vaccine is completely safe and effective. Right? Because that means that the drug companies knew there may be a problem. And in fact, what this reanalysis showed in the journal, published in the journal Vaccine, by the way, where they showed greater harm, that showed a rate of serious adverse effects from the highest quality level of evidence of at least 1 in 800. Probably much higher for lots of other reasons. But why that's important is the public and doctors, and that's why I also was brought into the narrative, have always believed that vaccines have a special place in medicine. They are safe and effective. The rate of serious adverse events from other vaccines traditionally is about 1 in a million. if we had known about this from the beginning,
okay, well, let me just pick you up there. Again, I'm just quoting the TGA here. They have identified 14 reports where the cause of death was linked to vaccination. From 985 reports received and reviewed, there have been no new vaccine-related deaths identified since 2022. So that's the TGA here that are saying that. Your claim that there have been 30,000 excess deaths from heart disease, you are a cardiologist, so this is your area of expertise. What's your evidence that the COVID vaccine is either partly responsible to a small degree, to a large degree? What's the evidence that you base that on?
Well, yeah, so that 1-800 figure from the highest quality level of evidence, 40% of those serious adverse events were related to clotting. So what that means is heart attack, lung clots, and stroke. We have every level of evidence from what we call randomized controlled trial data, high quality observational data from Israel, where they found that, published in the journal Nature Scientific Reports, very reputed journal, a 25% increase, Rowan, and this is really shocking, of cardiac arrests or heart attacks in people aged between 16 and 39, associated with the COVID vaccine, not associated with COVID. In the UK, Professor Norman Fenton, very eminent professor of risk, emeritus professor at Queen Mary University, he did his own analysis separately on the excess deaths in the UK, and I'll come on to Australia in a second. And what he found was, from his own analysis, is either directly from the vaccine or indirectly, based upon what we call the yellow card reporting scheme in the UK, and he looks at evidence in America as well, that 50% of the excess deaths in the UK right now are directly because of the COVID vaccines. Now, the Australian Bureau of Statistics only very recently also have come out and said that in Australia, you've got a 15 to 17% increase in excess deaths since 2021 for the rollout of the vaccine, majority of which is not related to COVID. So for me, you can't give an absolute, the main cause of the vaccine, but without a shadow of doubt, it's a main contributing factor. And on that, I understand here, there are three senators, Malcolm Roberts, Ralph Babet, and Gerard Rennick, right? They have called for an inquiry here into this, and I think that's really important. I think they're on the money, and if I honestly think they will go down, I'm not just saying this as heroes in Australia, because they will be on the right side of history on this.
Asim, we on the show have also called for a royal commission into all aspects of abuse of power during COVID. James?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, you talk about this narrative that developed around these things, and I guess it comes out of the sort of anti-vax narrative around kids' vaccines before the pandemic. But how is it that, the pharmaceutical companies, and there was this narrative that everybody bought into, lots of people bought into, I bought into, how did they wind up also, though, getting everybody in all of the media organizations, and how did it become the kind of, you're either, if you're with us or you're against us or science denier, how did that narrative get influenced by was it the weight of money that the pharmaceutical companies had? Was it a big PR effort? Because you're asking us to sort of accept that this groupthink developed and that nobody was able to question any of these sorts of things as they were rolling out. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think, having studied this for many, many years and even gone to the European Parliament in 2018, understanding that pharma had too much control and power over politicians, over the media, over regulators, over academic institutions. That has been increasing since the 80s. So unfortunately, most of the funding now to even academic institutions comes from the pharmaceutical industry. Again, where there's a huge conflict, they are there to make money, right? That's what they're there to do. And they often will deceive people in that process. So there's an element of that. But I think also what's happened, which is unprecedented, is you said, why were people not made aware of it? There was a deliberate suppression of doctors and academics who were saying, when the evidence changed and were going on social media, I got banned on Facebook calling out the fact that the evidence on face masks was not great.
There's the Twitter files, we've seen all that come
All that kind of stuff. I got permanently banned, by the way, from LinkedIn when I first went on GB News and said there was a potential signal of harm in October 2021 with a vaccine that needs investigating. And I was like, how has that happened? Just from one interview that went viral, and I gave a very measured narrative at that point. And then I found, LinkedIn's owned by Microsoft, Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Let's talk about that briefly.
No, I was going to stop you there. No, because I don't want to go down the Bill and Melinda Gates route at all.
I think sometimes people look and say, okay, it's big pharma, it's a conspiracy. I think quite often it's not that. It's, as James touched on, this group thing. And people are scared to come forward because there's all sorts of repercussions. We saw that with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kulldorff, all these experts who were completely slandered. And straight in Australia, we had Dr. Karen Phelps come out and talk about her own vaccine injury. She was a massive, in my opinion, COVID hysteric. But once she did, then we had ABC journalists and all these other people who'd also experienced side effects, but didn't feel like they could share that without being called an anti-vaxxer or being called some sort of a, conspiracy theorist. So it's interesting. I think it's often not some grand conspiracy. Yeah. It's just this climate of censorship.
Absolutely not. I agree. It's not a conspiracy. These are structural failures, cock-ups, incompetence, but being fueled and driven by money. And when you come back to these comments from people like Mark Dweck and the TGA, all I ask the public and doctors to be aware of is follow the money and you will get closer to the truth. And right now, we are here fighting for medical ethics, we're fighting for informed consent, but ultimately we're fighting to improve patient outcomes. And the bigger picture issue, unfortunately, across the whole world, is that people's health, mental and physical health, is going in the opposite direction. And for me as a doctor, my responsibility is to understand why that is, and is there a role of the medical profession involved in this? Most doctors and nurses, by the way, go into the profession to do the right thing, but most of them are not aware of the system failures that contribute to information they receive that they believe to be true, which is being influenced by these very powerful corporate interests who actually are misleading for the purposes of profit.
Dr. Aseem Malhotra, thanks so much.